name is Bob Dickey. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now it is. To start over. My name is Bob Dickey. I was involved in the music scene. It's cutting in and out.
Yeah. Let's not put this.
You want to leave it on the edge?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Sit out of the frame.
Well,
Yeah, it's out of the frame. The frame is mainly
Okay.
a bus thing, so.
Okay. Go ahead.
My name is Bob Dickey. I was involved in the music scene on the east side beginning in about the mid-'60s and went into the early '70s with a number of bands. I started out, like a lot of kids, post-Beatles, interested in making music. It all of a sudden became the thing to do, to get drums, get the guitars, get together with your friends and try and make music. Whether we had ideas of being stars or having girls chase and scream after us, I'm not so sure. It was just the idea that this was fun. This is what everybody's doing nowadays. And I remember my best friend at the time, Bob O'Connor, was the first person to get a guitar, and we would spend our Saturdays riding buses around town, going from one music store to the others, from LaDuca's to Zeb Billings to Faust to the different stores that sold music, sold records, sold music equipment. It consumed our life. It's what we talked about all day long. And actually, to jump back just a little bit, when Bob and I had paper routes on the Lower East Side as 12 and 13-year-olds, 11, 12, 13-year-olds, we would do our collecting at night on Thursday and Friday night. And when we would be out at Friday night, there was a club on Prospect Avenue called the Avant-Garde. During the summertime, the windows would be open and you'd hear music coming out. And it was just a curiosity for us. Like a siren's call. We were drawn to what was going on in that place. And then as we started to, keep an eye on it and see the people that were coming and going, it was a bohemian crowd. This would have been 1962, 63. And these were people that didn't look like the kids I went to school with. They were older, late teens, early 20s, and it just had a fascination, and the music had a fascination. It took a number of years for us to get up the gumption to actually stick ourselves in, go inside and see if we could go upstairs and see what was going on. And we did it eventually, and I believe the first person we saw in there might have been Dave Ray, Spider John Kerner, and little son Tony Glover, but I can't absolutely sure of that. I know that the first rock band I saw was at an Atwater summer beach party in Shorewood. They had bands play on top of the beach house, and some of my friends from Shorewood said, hey, we should go down there on this Friday night or Saturday night, warm June night as I recall. And it was a band called the Regents, which were local musicians from Shorewood High School. They were 2 or 3 years older than us, I think. And it was instantly an amazing thing for me to see young people, pretty similar to what I was, out there making music, entertaining people dancing, loving them, the music and the good times they were having, dancing, and everything about it just gelled and made it for a festive, fun thing. And the attraction was like, honey to a bee. So my friend got a guitar, and I talked my parents into loaning me some money that I would pay back on a scheduled payment plan. Went to Faust Music on the south side, got a bass guitar of no name value. Everyone always mistook it for a Kingston bass, but it really wasn't. And then I got another loan after I paid that off, and got a Fender Bassman amp that I bought brand new. It was really something, and I was the loudest guy around for a while. Not that I knew how to play though. And that was the next thing. Was after just realizing that you can't just buy a guitar and instantly know how to play them. My friend Bob and I sought out to get people to teach us what we needed to know about guitars. And Bob was the first person to take lessons from Fred Schmidt. Fred Schmidt and and Gordy Elliott were in a band called the Outlaws. They also played under the name Tall Paul and the Shorties, and they were students at Dominican High School, I believe, at that time, and they were my sister's age, was about 5 years older than I am. Bob was taking lessons from Fred Schmidt, and Fred got busy with more advanced students, and he pawned Bob off to Gordy Elliott. And in short order, Gordy Elliott said, I've got a young student who's really good, and he'll work with you, and he'll charge you less. And that was a big part of it. And introduced us to Bob Metzger. And this was a kid our age who was in school, junior high, or maybe just starting freshman years at Shorewood High School, and he was giving lessons to students for, I don't know, $5 or $10 a half hour or an hour, whatever it was. And we started taking lessons from Bob, and we would go over to his house, and he was always alone at home. His mom worked second shift, and so it was kind of teenage. It was a teenage hangout, and there were always people coming and going. They were all musicians, and we had great times there. I think that I learned a little bit. I didn't learn enough, and I never really excelled at playing music, although I was in some bands, and we did play around. We played for house parties. We played at a few like youth center jobs, but my friends really rapidly moved into a much higher realm of musical knowledge and complexity, and I soon figured out that it wasn't my thing. So. But I still wanted to be on the scene and hanging out, and when Bob and his friends in other bands had jobs, I would go along. Sometimes O'Connor, sometimes not, and we'd out of friendly gestures, you'd carry equipment and help out in the setup, and that eventually led to my actually working for them. I think a really interesting thing about the evolution of bands is how young guys that are getting together to make music evolve into businessmen. It's a part of the process, and you start making money more regularly. You start to buy equipment together. You start investing in a PA system, and it was an early lesson in business. And one of the things that evolved was that I had a regular job carrying equipment and helping set up and being around the band to do the things that they needed done. As we got into our college years, it turned out to be more. They were booking themselves. John did some of the booking, and then Metzger did some of the booking, and they came to me and said, we're really busy with everything that we're doing. Would you take this over and handle the telephone calls, handle the contracts, make the contacts, look for jobs for us, start developing us into other areas that we're not currently playing. And I didn't, of course, know anything about this, but I said, sure, give it a try, and we did. We promoted ourselves as best we could through what limited resources we knew about at the time, which were things like print up band cards, and John was a fine arts student and was very good at creating promotional material, posters. So you take a staple and a bunch of posters that you get copied, and you go around and you literally do what the circus people did at the turn of the century, and plaster your next job up on telephone poles around the east side and hope that a crowd will show up. So we did a lot of that, and there came a time when the band got approached by a real booking agency, and we were sort of this is now the Ox that's playing on a regular basis, three-piece band. Brad Sipe was the drummer at that point, and although the original drummer was Scott Nelligan, Bob Metzger and John Paris.
Now, what year was this?
Well, it start of college would have been fall of '68, where I'm talking about that transition to a little more elevated level of things. It had been pretty steady up to that. Those last high school years, '67 and '68, were very productive in terms of the jobs coming on a regular basis. Looking back, in the earlier interviews, John mentioned that he's got calendars that go back to that period, and he knows every job that we played. I would guess that if we look back there, that during that 67 to 68 period, there were jobs at least 4 or 5 a month, and sometimes many more than that. So it was Friday, Saturday nights on a regular basis, and then sometimes you'd end up playing someplace on a Sunday afternoon, or there'd be some special occasion on a holiday, and we were working a lot for who we were just high school kids. As we got into the college years, we started to be able to, I think we might have even played some bars before we got out of high school, but certainly once high school or college started, we were playing more in the bar scene on Friday and Saturday nights, and that was a little different. Those are things that were booked different than you would book a CYO, where you just call up and you talk to Father Sullivan, and he goes, "Yeah, we'll pay you $125. So see you Friday night." It was very simple, and we didn't have contracts. But as you got into club dates and that, you started to have contracts, started to be a little more formalized, and we did get approached by a person that was running an agency, or at least starting to get an agency up and going, and he had managed to sign a band named Short Stuff, which was a hot new group, and now we're moving to like 1970, 71, I think. Named Short Stuff, starring Jim Liben and Junior Brantley, Kenny Birdall, who had played in the Corporation on bass guitar, Kenny Arnold, who had been in a number of bands in and around Milwaukee, and Eric Epstein, who had also played with the New Blues for a while. And they had a great sound. They had a blues groove that was as good as, if not better than, New Blues, which I think was one of the best bands that ever came out of Milwaukee, and went on to become A.B. Sky, and had a little bit of success, and then devolved, I think you might say. At any rate, Tom Kakaliris had Short Stuff, and that was a big draw for us to be associated with that name, and made the proposal to the band, John and Bob, and John and Bob came to me and said, "We've had this offer, and you've just started relatively recently booking us, and what we were thinking of going back to Kakaliris and saying that we'd like to book with his agency, but we want Bob Dickey to have a job," which was an amazing thing that they did for me. And I was going to school, usually part-time during this, because again, I was working a lot of bar nights with Bob and John, and carrying equipment and doing setup, road manager work, and then working at the agency for at least 4 hours a day, and trying to take some classes. So it was a busy time, but I started making some fairly good money, because not only did I get to book Ox and Hound Dogs, as those were my set friends, I got to book Short Stuff, which billed out at a large, a slightly higher dollar figure, and there were other acts on the inventory, the agency inventory as well, that I could book. So we were putting people in bars around the state, and still doing CYOs and high school dances, and it was a pretty lucrative thing. Made some for a college student, and the band, and that was a big part of it. The musicianship improved, the showmanship improved, the quality of, and as those things happened, the quality of the locations that we were able to play improved, and so we moved into some nice opportunities, and we did some things that didn't pay all that well, but gave the band an opportunity to work regularly. When we played a place called Catacombs Coffee House, which was out on about 30th in Wisconsin. It was attached to a church, and it was kind of a youth outreach program that this church had. And there was a fellow named Frank Habib who ran it, and he didn't think there was any way that he could attract the level of talent that Ox and Hound Dogs and the rest represented. But we looked at it as an opportunity to play every Monday night, to give us an opportunity to have a little opportunity to bring in some money, pay some bills, and have a regular rehearsal session where you could work out new songs, work out new arrangements, get crowd reaction from the new tunes that you were adding to your list, and that turned out to be a valuable thing. before that, similarly, Jim Charney had made it possible for us to work regularly on Thursday night while some of us were still in high school. John had started college, but the rest of us were still in high school. We played regularly on Thursday nights at the Avant Garde, a coffee house on the east side that is a Milwaukee legend for its role in all sorts of all things coffee house, poetry, film society, folk music, blues music, and then eventually rock music with bands like the Baroques and the Velvet Whip, later to be called Furry Quimslash and the Love Muscle, and it was quite the place. And that's what I had mentioned earlier that Bob O'Connor and I had stumbled on when we were very young, and it evolved over that decade of the '60s and lasted, I think, into the early '70s before it finally closed its doors the final time. There's a wonderful history about all of its troubles in Kaleidoscope's or Bugle American's history of the east side of Milwaukee. Because it went to rock and roll music, there was a lot of noise, there was a lot of neighborhood reaction. There were also all the issues with Police Chief Harold Breyer and the East Side Narcotics Squad that thought that it was a drug center, thought it was a bad place for Milwaukee's youth to be hanging out, and so they put a lot of pressure on that, and there was a lot of upheaval in the air there as well. There were riots at Water Tower Park, which were the equivalent of what Buffalo Springfield sang about on Sunset Boulevard in '66 in LA. Milwaukee had its own versions of that in '68 and '69. There was just a lot of youth out on the street. They were long-haired, and music and revolution were in the air, so to speak. And there was a lot of resistance among a very conservative element in Milwaukee and the Milwaukee Police Department. And there were a lot of times when the cry of police harassment was not necessarily fictitious. Sometimes it was, but not always. And the outgrowth of the Water Tower Park kind of protests that took place there, because people wanted a place to hang out, and it got to be large numbers, and they talked about unlawful assembly and those type of issues, and always wanted to move people along. There were negotiations with the city fathers, and the result was a place called the alternate site. And it was the alternate site to the Water Tower Park on the top of the bluff just south of St. Mary's Hospital. And they moved the location down below the bluff, north of Bradford Beach, if I recall correctly. And they built a permanent stage and allowed people to have concerts. There was some kind of an organizing committee that allowed bands to play on the weekends during daylight hours. And it was, as I recall, it was mostly a Sunday afternoon thing. Ox, Hound Dogs, Short Stuff, Omaha, many bands played down there over the years, and it became a kind of a success story, I would say, for Milwaukee, solving what was clearly a problem at one point. In addition to that, during the summer of '69, through another whole set of friends that I had met, I had the opportunity to run a record store. I was approached by a man named Ron Raffy. He said he was going to take over the lease on what had been a drugstore on Farwell and Irving, and was wondering, because he heard that I knew a lot about music and had a large record collection, if I'd give him some advice about how to run a record store. And we started talking, and he had some money. Where it came from, I don't know, but he started ordering records and filling the shelves, and we took this old drugstore and painted the walls wild purple and orange colors, and started selling records. And at some point in the conversation, it was a nameless operation. I said we should call it Sound Suppository, as we were sitting around throwing names out, and everybody glommed on that name, and I, as soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, no, you don't understand. And they were insistent that it was a great name for a record store, and I was insistent that they were misunderstanding the word suppository to mean repository, and clearly that was what they thought. And the evolution was our slogan became Sound Suppository. We got, I think even Bugle American once or twice published that. So we went into business on a wing and a prayer with Ron's limited budget, and sometimes I bet we only had 300, 400 records in the store. But in typical fashion for the day, we sold pipes and bongs and incense and bumper stickers and buttons and all sorts of paraphernalia, and lots of underground papers from around the Midwest and from the Rolling Stone and Berkeley Barb. Occasionally we'd get somebody would make a trip out to California and bring a whole bunch of papers back, and so we sold just about anything that the hippie music culture would have wanted. And it became a little more formalized, but Ron's resources and business acumen, I think it's safe to say, was elementary, and we got to a point where distributors would not deal with us. It was cash on delivery, wouldn't give us any credit, and there was pretty stiff competition from two other stores. One that became the more successful was 1812 Overture, and Alan Dahlberger, who was a person that we knew, who was in our orbit of friends on the North Shore, and he was highly organized and knew what he was doing, had the business savvy to put together a really good operation, and I drifted away from Sound Suppository before it wrapped up, but I think I would guess it only lasted about 18 months, maybe 2 years at most, and I was probably there a little over a year. My friend Kurt Neufeld, who also worked with me with bands doing the road managing, as Ox got bigger, the equipment got bigger, the operation got bigger, we were able to move everything around in a VW microbus. That turned into eventually getting a large Conaline van. We went from very small PAs to a very large, cumbersome, heavy PA system, and so more people got involved, more people were making a little bit of money, and that was the nature of our. As I look back on it now, I mean, these are our part-time jobs that we put ourselves through college. This is what we did to pay the bills, to buy pay rent, buy food and drink, and not much beyond there. There was no 401 savings accounts, that's for sure.
Who were other big bands in Milwaukee at the time, and what are your recollections about them?
Well, going back to high school, I mean, the big bands, and it was interesting the other night when we were talking to people, the Del Reys, everybody mentioned the Del Reys, which was Craig Cramp, who eventually had a relationship. He and his cousin, or I think it's his cousin, Carl Cramp and Craig Cramp, were involved with the Robs, and I think I only saw D-Rob and the Robins, although they were a huge name. They had a recording contract and that, but they usually were playing in venues that I couldn't get into. I was too young, or they were too far away. Marty Zifko's ballroom in out way west, western suburbs, and that. We did play with D-Rob and the Robs a couple times out at Pius High School, as I recall, and so they were huge. Originally, of course, it was the Legends. And I mentioned Gordy Elliott and Fred Schmidt in the Outlaws. They were not as big as the Legends, for sure, or the Robs, but they were technically excellent. Both those guys were really fine musicians, and I don't know who the drummers were or not. A legendary band that I always wanted to hear and never heard was the Unit, that played at the Avant-Garde, and I believe Jeff Dagenhart and Jim Lieben and Augie Deriska and some other people played in that. It was the seminal, what I've come to be told by others, it was the seminal rock and roll blues group in Milwaukee. There wasn't a big blues scene here the way there was in Chicago. Or if there was, we didn't know about it on the east side and the North Shore, us suburban kids. If there was some real rootsy blues music going on, it was hidden to us. We were more aware of the burgeoning black R&B, big show bands, Vic Pitts and the Cheaters, El Rey and the Night Beats, and most particularly Harvey Scales and the Seven Sounds, who, unlike the previous two bands, Harvey and the Seven Sounds played a lot of youth places. They played a lot of CYOs and high school dances where you actually got to see them as kids that had no connection to ghetto music at that time. And very impressed with that. Very impressed with the showmanship of a big show band with 4, 5, 6-piece horn sections and just snap, crack production values as bands. I mean, for those who weren't there, a lot of the youth bands were pretty sloppy. I mean, they were just learning Louie Louie. They were just learning how to play little Latin loopy-loo. It was not great at the beginning, but when you saw those kind of guys, when you saw even the Corporation and some of the bands like the Del Reys, they had it down. They knew what they were doing. They were sharp. They were rehearsed.
Was radio the main way to learn about new music, and what radio stations were you listening to as you grew up in Milwaukee?
Well, to begin with, it was definitely WOKY and WRIT, and I remember having arguments with friends about which one was better, which one was hipper, which one got to the new music a little faster, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, we're in the Chicago. We're close enough to Chicago that WCFL and WLS, two big rockers during that period, were also available to us, certainly when we were driving around in cars. And I think so we had those 4 buttons in everybody's car, I think. So I would say that those were primary. Then as we get into underground radio, late 60s, the whole scene changes from AM to FM. And there's the WTOS and Bob Reitman, and I followed Reitman from WUWM, which is a college radio station, NPR style radio station, and Reitman had a Sunday night program called It's All Right Ma, It's Only Music, and I don't know, I can't tell you how I stumbled onto it, but I know late in high school, my sister and I became a Sunday night tradition to listen to Reitman, to listen to, I think it always ripped open with River High, Mountain Deep was his opening number every week, and you knew that you were going to get a huge serving of Bob Dylan. You were going to get some Firesign Theater, which he introduced us to. He played a lot of little comedy bits from them and other obscure things. He played poetry readings from time to time to mix it up. It was eclectic. And that's, I think most people, when they look back on and do any studies about underground radio, that's probably one of the key words that you would use to describe it, because by that point, top 40 radio in the post-Beatle British invasion era had become more and more routinized to that top 40 schedule, and you didn't hear anything out of it, and even more and more, you only heard the top 15 songs in heavy rotation, and so there wasn't a lot of variety. It was good music, and we all liked it for the most part, although we made fun of certain artists that we thought were really sappy, but there was good music around on the AM dial. But the FM dial had a great allure because it was playing the album cuts that you and your friends liked anyway. You bought the Rolling Stones' first album to hear, Tell Me, and then you found all this other stuff, and that's what somebody come over and you go, you got to listen to this cut on side 2. That became my thing. I wanted to discover new things and find cool new sounds that grabbed my ears, and then my evolution as a music person, I was always reading what was in parentheses under the song title. I don't know how that started for me, but I started noticing certain patterns. I started noticing names, whether because of the repetition of seeing Phil Spector's name over and over again, or seeing Coffin King, seeing different writing teams. Certainly with the Stones, you saw Jagger Richards, you saw Lennon McCartney, and then that other song, that they didn't write, who are those people? Where did that come from? And up until just even this most recent trip, we were having a conversation because my wife and I were in a store, in a restaurant, and then Muzak was playing Anna, a version that I'd never heard before, and it wasn't the original, and it wasn't the Beatles, and whether it's a cover version that it was just on a kind of Muzak track or whatever, but we sought out those people that had written those songs, so that led us to finding out, the man behind King Bee, and that it took a long time for some of us because that was kind of obscure. The Brits seem to have a better record stores than we did in a lot of cases, but going back to radio. WTOS with Bob Reitman after he came off of UWM, which was a college radio station where he was doing a volunteer show. I believe there was no money involved. To underground radio at WTOS where he was probably making a little bit of money. And then I think the next one was WZMF where they became the two competitors. They became the FM competitors equivalent to WRIT and WOKY. It was, which hip station do you listen to, ZMF or TOS? And I think finally TOS did, I think TOS was for Wauwatosa. It was out on the west side. The TOS stood in place of TOSA. I think that went away, and ZMF became the big powerhouse for a number of years. And then finally, the last of my radio listening years of the underground style would have been WQFM, which was a downtown station here in town, and that was when, by the time WQFM comes along, underground radio, what we called underground radio, was becoming the new top 40. It was becoming much more of a regimented playlist. There was still room for a creative radio programmer to set a tone and set a style, and allow disc jockeys some freedom in putting together a show that had some musical cohesion, but it did start to have more and more songs in heavy rotation. Classic example that people laugh about is Staircase to Heaven. Started being played every night at 3 or 4 times, and you heard less and less of the more obscure tracks on something, and you heard less and less of obscure artists who weren't breaking through with a big hit, but had put together a nice album that had a couple of good songs on it, and somebody at the radio station just liked it and played it a lot, and everybody around the radio station liked it, and then all of a sudden they said, well, we should start playing this. That seemed to happen less and less, and became more of controlled by the musical corporations that were pushing certain artists and that was our perception, whether true or not. And so that was yes, radio was very important to the whole equation, because we had our record collections and we had our turntables and we listened to music at home, but the way to find out about music was listening to radio and reading publications about music. Rolling Stone being the biggest outlet at the beginning for me. Cream and other magazines were out there as well, but for me, Rolling Stone was always kind of my touchstone on what was going on, what was hip, what was cool.
What about local publications? Well,
Kaleidoscope was the first paper in town that I was aware of, and there started to be, going back to the mention about the tension with the East Side community, the hip community, and so-called police harassment with the long hairs and the East Side students, just people at UWM, people hanging around the North Avenue Big Boy. There were issues there. There were such large crowds outside the Big Boy, and Suburbia. The first Suburbia sandwich shop was right around the corner from there. That corner was a big hangout point, and that's what pushed over around the corner to the Water Tower Park as crowds got bigger, and that. As those issues kind of bubbled up, it seemed in my mind simultaneously Kaleidoscope showed up on the scene, and again, much like like a print version of the coffee shop, it was music, culture, poetry, hip health in terms of, you know, sexual information you needed to know, how to get information about birth control, all those kind of things that were now are so, I mean, they're on bus cards and they're handed out in high schools. All of that was kind of, you know, very, very hidden and very difficult for people to find out. What do you do if you're pregnant and don't want to be pregnant? What do you do if you want to have, you know, you're having sex and you need birth control? Where do you go? You certainly didn't ask your parents in most cases. All that kind of that stuff was sort of got served up by an underground press, and in Milwaukee it was the Kaleidoscope, which was a weekly, and John Coyce was the editor. Bob Reitman was the original poetry editor, I think, and John Solly and others on the Milwaukee Bohemian community were all involved in it. And I don't know where it first popped up, but I brought it home. I brought home a copy, and my sister and I were looking at it, and they were appealing for people to have subscriptions, and we said, well, maybe we should do that. You know, it was only $15 for a year or something, whatever. It was ridiculously low, and we decided to split it. And there was a telephone number we called and then said, well, how do we get the money to you? Where do we mail it? And they said, well, you can drop it off at our. Well, where are you? And it turned out we lived. My parents' home was in the 3400 block of Kramer, and John Coyce was living in the 3400 block of Oakland. It was literally straight shot through one of our neighbors' backyards into their backyard. We went over. They had an upper flat, and it was their printing press, and it was their newsroom. They had typewriters around, and all these people sitting around with a funny smell in the air, and working on a newspaper, and so. Was somewhat involved in that, but mostly just I was mostly just you know, somebody that bought the paper, read the paper, and that. Later, being involved with Sound Suppository, I bought ads in there. And notable issue about Kaleidoscope is that it was charged with pornography. There's much long histories that you can read about their fight. They went all the way to the Supreme Court over the Yab Young photograph of a